Hello, I'm Arthur, and this is my wife, Teresa, and this is Adventist Talk. First movie review.
We have our movie review hats on.
That's right.
I don't
That's
know why.
right.
There's no reason we did this. I don't know why we did it. We just thought we had these hats and we just thought we'd put them on.
Here we go.
The Hopeful, the Adventist
Adventist movie,
The Hopeful. We keep wanting to say the Hopefuls.
As we entered the local Regal cinema, we saw what looked like a small group, few people, of their elderly, I would say, Seventh-day Adventist couples. We asked them if they were Seventh-day Adventists, and they replied, yes, and uncomfortably, you could tell, as if we had put a spotlight on their faces, revealing they were in a theater. So I figured our Catholic angels, before coming in with us to watch the Seventh-day Adventist movie, would momentarily stand around talking to the Seventh-day Adventist guardian angels that would stay outside the theater during the movie. When the lights dimmed, we saw several Adventists at advertisements, which I had never seen many Seventh-day Adventist advertisements before.
Never, not ever.
One from the official Seventh-day Adventist Church, one from Hope Channel, and another from ADRA. The movie previews were all for Christian films, and a Catholic one was thrown in for shock value.
Yeah, I'm sure that was Regal Cinema doing that. I don't think that Adventist.
Yes.
I don't think they paid for all those previews. But
Right.
anyway.
Then there was a pre-movie interview of the composer who wrote the theme song for The Hopeful. Why not interview the screenwriters or actors or someone who was touched by the movie? It was a bit like the old Hollywood self-aggrandizement trick, like the red carpet screaming fans to convince you before you heard it that the music was amazing, which it wasn't. The song was mundane at best, and as if the music was a bigger part of the movie than anything else. Then the movie began. It started out with the normal preface of, this is based on a true story. But take that in the same way that the song Springtime for Hitler from the producer's movie was based on a true story. It was exactly what we had predicted in our pre-review.
Yeah, the episode we did.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was the 2006. It basically was just the 2016 movie Tell the World with a few added scenes.
So the cinematography was professional.
It's very,
I think
it was
that
nice.
both the Mormons
Yeah.
and the Adventists are doing a better job on some cinematography than like all the other like evangelical. Those movies like
that's really
Something
true.
is Dead, God is Dead, and all those.
Right. Right.
The one with Kirk Cameron, the Left Behind series. I don't think the cinematography was that great.
No,
so this one
they actually had some good cinematography.
You know what I think they did? I think that they went back and watched The Village.
That's true.
And they took the tips from The Village on how to create
the kind of ambiance and things that the movie The Village did.
Yeah.
Kind of had that feel.
So what do you think about the acting?
Well, the girl that played Ellen White, she already is an actress. She's not a Seventh-day Adventist that they put in the part as Ellen White. She did a pretty good job.
Yeah, I thought the acting, they definitely had a few people that did not seem like actors, that they were just like Adventists who wanted to become actors.
Right.
and so anyway, yeah. So I think there were some that did William Miller, What do you think?
So this is the way I would put William Miller's part. If you were to take about a third to maybe half
Uh-huh.
of what William Miller's actor did, and that's all it was,
Uh-huh.
then it would be okay.
Uh-huh.
But it's like he never gets he kind of has one once he starts the William Miller hat that he
Mhm.
puts on, he stays in this. There's no human fluctuating that
Yeah.
most humans have. It seems kind of straight. I don't know how to put it,
Yeah.
but it just didn't have a human feel. Like we said, it felt like a caricature of
Yeah.
William Miller
Well,
instead of actually person.
I wrote a screenplay called Midnight Cry, and I wrote it, oh my goodness, 10 years ago. And in my mind, I anticipated the guy, oh my word, now I forgot his name, the guy from Silence of the Lambs. Who is
Uh,
who's
Anthony
Anthony
Hopkins.
Hopkins. I imagine
Yeah.
Anthony Hopkins in the William Miller role. And so
Oh wow. Yeah.
yeah. And so, the guy was fine, but he was no Anthony Hopkins. So anyway, so Joshua Himes, you
Mhm.
made an interesting assessment of Joshua
Mhm.
Himes.
So Joshua Himes, to me, what he brought to this movie, the actor that played Joshua Himes, it was some energy. They definitely needed the energy, but Joshua Himes' part was played by a man that seemed reminiscent of maybe the BBC Charles Dickens character, like Little Dorrit series, maybe the Rent Collector from Little Dorrit series, Mr. Panks,
Yeah.
that kind of intense energy.
Yeah. If you don't get the references here, look them up because
It
that
makes
the
make
Little Door
yeah.
is really an actually excellent series, BBC series.
Right. And Mr. Panks had
Yeah.
he collected money, but he was just in very intense. Now the Joshua Himes actor
Uh-huh.
had some of that,
Yeah.
but he still felt like a caricature as well. He
Yeah.
didn't pull you into the part.
Yeah, but he seemed more like an actor to me
Yes, definitely. He definitely did.
than But anyway, I thought he did a good job. And now Joshua Himes was the guy that promoted. He was the promoter
Yeah,
of
yeah.
William Miller.
Hmm.
So, okay. Now here is where I think it left. Okay, so the hopeful, it was a bunch of scenes cut from Tell the World, and then they were put together. And to me,
So it was like a series that they just brought it all
yeah,
together,
yeah, and then they
added
cut it.
two
They,
parts, I think, of the boat scenes that kept on cutting to,
yeah, maybe I can't remember. I think so.
and I think the
But
white White's home.
yeah, well, I watched the hopeful. We watched the hopeful once, and then we watched the the world several times just to compare the two and
Right.
make sure. So now I'm getting the two confused. But what I did not like about it is that because you needed that, they took it out of a 2.5 hour
Right.
series
Right.
and they pushed it together, and I felt like they cut off the scenes were just so short. There was no character development in it, and there was no development of the story. It went too quickly, I think. And they created three stories in one because the first story was about William Miller, the second was about Ellen White, and
Mhm.
the third was about the Adventist beginnings. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to break up our review into two different reviews because the movie was actually several stories, and so we need to kind of break it up so we don't make it the review of the
So it's
movie
like
is long. They're-
three stories in one movie,
yeah,
but you had the first one part was really William Miller, and the second
yeah.
part was Ellen
So
White.
we're kind of doing the William
Right.
Miller. Okay, so
Mhm.
right now, instead of not really, we're not going to review much of it anymore. We're just going to tell you the stuff that they left out of the hopefuls because this is important context that they left out.
Well, here's my take is that the context is absolutely left out. It's not partially left out. The context is so important, like you were just saying. You don't get the context of what this movie's supposed to be.
It should have been a horror story. It should
Really.
have been a
It,
horror movie, but
right. It felt like a little bit of Little House on the Prairie.
yeah,
Little House on the Prairieized is what it
yeah.
felt like.
So one of the first things, we're just going to give you some information, just to fill in the context. But the Adventist pioneers just boast in a lot of their at the time of this, when the movie was being made, the people of Miller's time boasted that Miller's youth was untarnished by secular or classical education. They thought this was such a good thing that Miller didn't know any of the ancient original biblical languages and was trained as a farmer, not a theologian. So, in fact, the Millerites in general made, quote, this is from the Millerites themselves, no pretensions to learning. They thought that was a good thing that he had not studied at all.
Right. So the movie played up Miller's wife being kind of the force behind Miller, telling the world she was that hero behind the hero.
Yeah.
Miller was reticent to preach. He didn't want to preach. He just kept on saying, "I'm just a humble farmer,"
Yeah. And it
over and
actually,
over again.
it they did this in the entire movie. It was like the women were pushing the men to do something. They were always the force behind the men, which was a little
Which doesn't follow
um
the character and the personality
yeah.
of these people. Not to say that the women wouldn't have any say, but the way they portrayed it was almost like the story was Miller's wife story. So
Well, you kind of feel sorry for him when he ended up being wrong.
that's right.
He just looked at his wife and said, "You made me do." So another thing is that they didn't really, and I'm sure they didn't have time to. This is not a criticism, but it just is good to know that during this time, right as Miller was finding out this, what he considered the great prophecy of the Lord coming, it was in the 1830s, and there was an unusual aurora borealis that happened during those times where
Yeah, it came further down into the United States
it was
than
south.
ever. Yeah, it was really
And
low in the
and it really was
United States.
spectacular, and a lot of people were not used to seeing that, and so they thought that was some kind of sign from heaven. And there were comets and meteors during that time. There were some severe blizzards. There was an eclipse of the sun, and there was even rumors of a cholera epidemic in Europe. And so everybody, they were all the Christians of that time in that area were kind of talking about, are these signs?
That's right.
Signs of the times. And the very well-known, I don't remember what he was, whether he was Calvinist or not, but Reverend Finney said, and this is a quote, he said, all of this stuff that was going on was a prelude to woes which are fast coming upon the earth. And there were at least 54 end time prophecies and date setting around that time. So it wasn't just Miller that did this. He was one of many.
Yeah. And that's why it's so this is exactly what what we said a few minutes ago, is that's really important to know. This whole you don't have just Miller or one or two others. You had many people making all kinds of prophetic things,
Yeah.
all making all kinds of statements of grandeur, that everything's happening, stars are falling,
Yeah.
everybody's going to die.
Yeah.
You need to become our religion.
So when he started, William Miller was published his lectures in the Vermont Telegram and was called Biblical Prophecy and the Advent Near. Now, the one thing, though, that he did not focus on is he really didn't focus on Jesus and the gospel. His lectures were more like explaining mathematical calculations of the scriptures. So he wasn't like a normal preacher, even though he got his preacher's license from, was it Christian Connection? I think it was. I don't know. We're just going to guess on that. Okay. So there was a guy that he came to, it was a preacher that hosted Miller giving his lectures, and he was called Reverend Springer from the Methodist Episcopal Church. And he criticized Miller after having him listen to him. He said, you know, Miller, is evidently disposed to make but little allowance for those who think differently from him on the millennium, dealing often in terrible denunciations against such as oppose his particular views on this point. So, so he did have some clergy against him and for him, and I do think that the movie brought that out. I think that you know, they were pretty fair about the fact that Miller did have a lot of clergy that believed what he said.
So it's not just other churches condemning him. He had the press condemning him as well, such as in Horace Greeley's Tribune. It was devoted an entire issue to denouncing the movement. Miller's adherents were illiterates and millennium quacks. I mean, they were hard on them. They whacked them.
And he said that if you could only put together all the prophecies from the time Christ died to then, and that all of these people that said the Lord was going to come, if you could put them all together and show the confidence of which they were put forth, and that the calculations were grounded on and as reasonably as they could be, that if we could just keep those in front of us, the world, Greeley said, the world would in the future be relieved from people like Miller, so we wouldn't have to go through this.
Right. So legitimate disagreements based on scripture were scorned and harshly judged by the Second Adventists.
That's another word from Millerites.
Yeah. They objected to the definite time, which a lot of them did. God's all-seeing eye read their hearts. They did not love Jesus near. They knew that their unchristian lives would not stand the test, for they were not walking in the humble path laid out by him.
Yeah.
Wow.
So these Millerites were kind of harsh towards those, and they kind of made themselves the victims. You know, and the movie did this. They made it look as if the Millerites were these terrible victims, and anyone who pointed out that their message was contrary to Scripture were condemned by the Millerites. They felt persecuted by those who refused to accept Miller's theories, and began to call them Babylon. Miller said those who became his followers were true believers, and those who didn't agree with him were the world. See, he claimed that their disagreements with him were errors of a fallen church. Now, these Adventists have always claimed that they were victims of bigotry and abuse during this time, but historians record a different reality. The historians, and I'm going to quote one, it was the Millerites who were the aggressors and who tried to force acceptance of their own views on others. Now, we're not going to take the time to do all the sourcing of what we're going to say, but it's very easily accessed. If you want to know the sources,
go to Amazon.com and look up It's Okay Not to Be a Seventh-Day Adventist, and all these are sourced in there.
Yes, we'll see all this. So, okay, so the Millerites were actually quite zealous. They would stand up at Sunday school loudly and promote their belief. They claimed those who dared to withhold from others the light God had given them. They said, oh, it was horrible that they were shut out of the churches.
Yeah.
To other people, they just seemed antagonistic.
Right, right. So the movie The Hopeful does not give an accurate depiction of what Adventists call the Great Disappointment when Christ did not appear that October 22, 1844, by any stretch. Almost, uh, I wouldn't say that they lied about it, but they left out 95% of it.
They actually left out what would have made an extremely interesting but terrible movie.
Yeah.
Because we're going to read you just some of the headlines that shocked the readers of their day and should shock us. Okay, so one story told of Charles Lyell of Plymouth and Boston, who sold his property, including several homes, and gave all his money all the way to the Midnight Crime Movement. This was before October 22. He believed that upon translation, when Christ would come, it would be a sin to have any money or holdings. And many Second Adventists had not planted or reaped that season and were left destitute. And some died of starvation later on when they
Right.
found out
Right.
they had no food because they didn't,
That's right.
reap and sow.
Yeah, and this is something. There were repercussions on a huge scale across the eastern seaboard. So we're not even barely even touching the repercussions of it. The book we just said, It's Okay Not to Be a Seventh-Day Adventist, on Amazon.com, gives you all the resources to that. It's amazing. So citizens of New England towns were livid because they were taxed to pay for get this. They were taxed because the Second Adventist crops had failed or weren't harvested. So there were enough of them that it actually affected the food supply in that area. Many of the cities sued these end of the worlders to recover their money. And you can't say that it's because they're all hated them or were, but it's like, what were they supposed to
Yeah.
do?
So they had to prevent devastating crop loss. And so they made people go out there and pick all the Adventist fields that were just left there.
Mm-hmm.
A few Millerites afterwards went to the courts and tried to regain control of the property they had given away or had sold at a fraction of the cost, and they claimed temporary insanity. Now, nothing compares to the horrible, horrendous stories of murder suicides of parents and children.
Yeah, it just it
They were so afraid of this last day that leading up to the date, they would kill their children and then commit suicide. It was,
Yeah, in the New Hampshire Patriot reported that children froze to death from exposure as their parents stood waiting in the cold.
yeah, and that
People,
October 22.
yeah, people literally went insane. And I'm not talking about one or two or 10.
Yeah.
It was a huge number.
Well, they said October 22 was especially cold that year. And so when all these people went outside and they thought, well, the Lord's coming, I don't need to put on a coat. And a lot of them were, there were stories of Millerites not feeding their children. And
Wasn't any point to.
yeah. And one even didn't allow their kids to go back in and go to the bathroom. That was one report.
But you have to understand is these reports weren't on one or two. There were many of these horrible stories.
So when the Lord didn't come October 22, the movie just talks about, a couple people being sad, but it doesn't really fully tell how horrific this was, because the Adventists had not just been disappointed, they were now destitute because
That's
many of
right.
them had closed their shops
Yeah.
and sold their farms and their crops and left their crops, like we already said.
They literally burned their bridges.
Yeah. So for the next 2 decades, there would be Millerites who would continue to set dates and were again disappointed
Mhm.
because they wanted to believe that they just had not calculated. Got to go back and fudge the numbers or something. And insanity was a massive problem for
Yeah.
Millerites.
Amorai Brigham. He was the head of the Utica State Lunatic Asylum. He authored a book on religion and lunacy, which included the Millerite disturbance. You have Concord Asylum, held 12 Millerite victims in early 1843. You have the Brattleboro Asylum. There were 26 people
Yeah.
in 1844, 32 in the New York Lunatic Asylum. Samuel B. Woodward, the superintendent of the Worcester State of Medical Superintendents of America institutions for the insane previous year, 7 cases could be charged to Millerism. He believed that in the other asylums of New England, Millerites constituted even a larger percentage of patients in the population.
Yeah. There were newspapers that said the state considers the disappointment of the Second Adventist was a public health threat greater than the yellow fever and cholera. Innumerable people not visibly traumatized enough to be instituted for insanity lived the rest of their lives in quiet desperation, according to a 19th century historian. There was one newspaper that said that a mother of 3 small children was admitted to the sanitarium in Utica, along with 38 others.
You have Reuben Brown, a Millerite preacher admitted to the South Boston Lunatic Asylum, leapt from the 4th story trying to escape, obviously killing him. Many admitted into the asylums would just sit and stare. The first volume of the Journalism of Insanity included an article on the Midnight Cry movement stating, "We have scarcely seen a newspaper for some months past, but contains accounts of suicides and insanity produced by it." End close quote.
Of Millerism, the Yale Review wrote, "Nothing is too absurd to be believed by somebody or when sufficiently excited by fanaticism to force its way like a moral tornado through all our churches."
President John Quincy Adams called Millerism ludicrous and compared it to the weird, unintelligent spirit of the age, such as astrology, witchcraft, mesmerism, and Mormonism. For prison and mental health facility reform, they used the Miller delusion as part of their platform for social change.
In his book, 3 Years in a Madhouse, Isaac Hunt wrote of his experience with a few of the Second Adventists. And this is, I'm going to quote from what he wrote. "If people could see, as I have seen, the wreck of human reason produced entirely by the terrible whirlwind of Millerism which swept over our land a few years since, they would be careful never to allow themselves to go into an exciting, miscalled religious meeting. I have been confined with an insane Millerite who was quite an intelligent man and taught in a country school for 14 winters. And the mental sufferings of that man were past all description. He would groan and sigh in such a manner that it could pierce you to the very soul with anguish to hear him. He imagined that he had committed the unpardonable sin and had lived a whole life of sin, that all of his acts had been sin of the deepest scarlet, and that hell was his inevitable doom forever. Another Millerite was in a very different state of mind from the above, and he was perfectly happy. He imagined that he was God and that there was no one above him. Why, he said, I am God, for I can jump through the side of this house and not make a hole of it. And none but God can do that. End quote.
Right. One Millerite woman admitted to the New Hampshire asylum walked the halls, swinging and clapping her hands, singing songs she had learned about the dreaded day of judgment from Miller's meetings.
That must have been very haunting to watch. A woman just walking through the halls, swinging her arms, singing, you
Uh,
know. Oh,
so by the end of the movement, several hundred Millerites were documented with insanity. And mind you, these are just the ones who happened to come to the asylums.
yeah,
They're not the only ones. It's just,
yeah.
these are the ones in the
Yeah, they
asylums.
said that there were many, many more that lived out their life in quiet despair.
So, a prevailing view among the Second Adventists was that the suicides, murders, and insanity be blamed on those who refused to prepare for judgment. But that was not the case. Those who had been the most dedicated to the movement that had been the most hurt by it. But true to the Second Advent form, they neither could be bothered with the facts nor disturbed by the consequences. So I really strongly recommend go get the book It's Okay Not to Be a Seventh-Day Adventist. It's on Amazon.com. It has these references in more expanded.
And it tells the story. The first few
Mhm.
chapters are telling the story of what happened, and the context of the great disappointment. So do you want to stop now and we'll just do the second half in it later?
We will do the second half later, and it'll be on the Ellen White half of the movie.
Yeah. Our hats off to you. I don't want to take my hats off. I
Yep.
don't know what my
Thanks
hair looks
for listening,
like.
and stay tuned for part 2.
Thank you.
God bless you.